Food. If you're like me, you think about food all the time. What am I going to have for breakfast? What am I going to have for second breakfast? What am I going to have for lunch? I'm sure some of you are already thinking about what you're going to have for lunch right now. As humans, food is our lifeline. Yet, producing it requires a lot of resources. In fact, up to 40% of our current habitable land is used to produce food. This sounds unthinkable when you think about all the forests and the glaciers and the deserts that aren't currently being used to produce food. And to put it into perspective, this area of land is only as big as the entire continent of Asia. That's all the land that we've got to feed 8 billion people and counting. And we're not producing any more for farming. And to get our food from the ground to the supermarkets to our plates is more complicated than we think. Each step, from growing it to processing it to distributing it across the world, adds up, releasing up to 30% of humanity's greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere. But I'd like to argue that the real crisis lies beneath our feet. Now, I'd like you to picture a hot, dry summer's day, where the ground is so cracked and parched that when strong winds come, they blow up dry soil up into the sky, darkening it with dust that eventually settles down onto the crops below. Actually, in this scenario, there aren't any crops. In fact, the soil is too loose to be able to hold any water needed to sustain life. This land that was once fertile has been so overworked and is now barren. And this prolonged drought that I'm describing actually happened across 5 states in the US in the 1930s. And it was known as the Dust Bowl, which came about from years of overworking and overfarming, leading to mass migration and food insecurity, showing us just how vulnerable we are when the soil that we depend on to feed us is degraded. And this event led to the then United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt issuing a stark warning. He said, "A nation that destroys its soil destroys itself." And yes, he may have said this decades ago in the 1930s, but 100 years later, it still matters. Today, up to 30% of our agricultural land, or the land that we use to produce food, is degraded. And if we don't act now, up to 95% is at risk of degradation by 2050. And this matters because up to 95% of our food is reliant on healthy soils. And there's so many ways of defining healthy soils, but all healthy soils have one thing in common: microorganisms. Now, I'd like you to take a moment and think about your favorite smell. For me, my favorite smell is that smell you get after rain hits the ground after a long dry spell. There's something so fresh and earthy about it that just feels so alive. And I'm not the only one who loves this smell. In fact, perfumers have even tried to capture it and bottle it. And this smell is called petrichor, and it's produced by living organisms in the soil that release a chemical when raindrops hit the ground. So when you think you're actually smelling damp soil, what you're actually smelling is this chemical produced by this living bacteria in the soil. And this bacteria is part of a much larger and living, diverse planet. In fact, there are 3 billion bacteria on the planet, and up to half of them live in the soil alone, alongside other tiny microorganisms. And if you take a look at soil closely, as in you're going to need an expensive microscope closely, you're going to see that amongst the soil particles and the debris are these tiny microorganisms, the bacteria, the fungi, and the protozoa, all existing in what we usually just think of as dirt. And in healthy soils, you'll find that there are billions of them. However, in soils like those in the Dust Bowl era, in degraded soils, you hardly find any of these communities because their natural communities or their numbers have been declined or have been reduced. And putting these microorganisms back into our soils or back into our degraded soils is the key to making them healthy again. And I'll tell you how that works. As an environmental biotechnologist, my work with these microorganisms started with a similarly simple yet ambitious question of how could I use these abundant species to restore degraded soils? And yes, there are so many of them everywhere, but I was looking for a super species. I was looking for that species that produced a nice smell, and I wanted to see what else it could do. And so to start with, I had this crazy idea of driving around in a car with a Petri dish in my hand, and my hand hanging outside the car window trying to catch them in the air. And believe it or not, it actually worked. But what grew in my dish was a mess, a biodiversity medley. It's the best way of probably describing it. And after a lot of trial and error, I came across this special microbe, and I reached out to some other scientists who sent me a strain that I could work with. And this microbe is called a cyanobacteria. And it's a special type of bacteria that exists in lots of different environments, in the soil, in fresh water, and you might be more familiar with them as they form algae blooms. And so after the next challenge, after getting this bacteria, was to grow them, not in nature, but in the lab. And so I've spent a lot of time and effort trying to fine-tune and refine the conditions in which they could grow. I controlled everything from the temperature to the light and even the nutrients, getting them from this to this, and finally larger scale. And the next step after growing them in the large scale was to then harvest it. And I ended up with this. So I spoiled the surprise. And this is essentially a concentrated amount of the algae in a dried powdered form. And when I applied it to the soil, I found out that they do more than just produce a nice smell. These bacteria have a lot of different benefits, but I'd like to highlight one. They're very good at capturing and storing carbon, which is essential for healthy soils. Soils that have more carbon have better structure, which means they're able to hold more water and more nutrients to supply to the plants. And they also are less vulnerable to erosion, unlike those soils in the Dust Bowl era. And they capture and store carbon in the most fascinating way. I'd like you to picture the soil as a bustling city, where the plants take up carbon dioxide from the air and use it to grow. And then when they die, the city's workers, that is the bacteria and other microorganisms such as the fungi, use the plant, feed on the plant material, breaking it down and in the process releasing waste carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And the remaining carbon is then used and stored in the soil to form stable structures that remain there for decades or even centuries. And then when they themselves die, the remains are broken down by other microorganisms that then use it to form even more stable carbon structures within the soil. A lot of people think that the majority of carbon in the soil comes from plants, but actually 80% of it comes from these microorganisms. In fact, the soil itself is the second largest store of carbon on the planet. There is more carbon in the soil than there is in all the world's vegetation and air. I repeat, there is more carbon in the soil than there is in all the world's vegetation and air. This makes the soil not only essential for producing great food, but it's also a good climate change solution. And to leave you with some food for thought, whilst adding these microorganisms to the soil is key to ensuring a healthy environment, we have to keep adding it to maintain the microbial community. And there's still a lot of economic and production challenges to consider. It's kind of like taking probiotics, where we take it to improve our gut health, but we have to keep replenishing it to maintain that healthy gut environment. But for a longer lasting solution, we're more likely to change our diet. And similarly, for a longer lasting solution in our soils, we need to change the way we farm to ensure that healthy microbial environment is not only there to thrive, not only there to survive, but to thrive. Ultimately, The future of our food systems relies on the vitality and the abundance of these microorganisms. So the next time you catch that lovely earthy scent after heavy rain, I'd like you to remember the billions of tiny microorganisms working tirelessly beneath our feet. They might be small, but their impact on our planet is immense. Thank you.